Daily Bible Time, Dominic Steele on a Monday morning, and thanks very much to the different people who send in questions. I really do appreciate them. I had one over the weekend. In chapter 24, the Lord's anger burned against David. Why? This is after David's praise to the Lord. And look, to the person who asked that question, just note chapter 24, verse 1, the Lord's anger burned against Israel again, and he stirred up David against them to say, go count the people of Israel and Judah. In chapter 24, verse 1, the Lord is not angry with David in this chapter. The Lord is angry with Israel. We've been so used to David being the recipient of the Lord's anger that we automatically think he is here, but actually he isn't. The Lord is angry with Israel as a whole, and David is to be the instrument of the Lord's judgment. So whatever it is, this sin of Israel, it seems as if it's not a personal sin of the king, but rather something that the nation has done. But we actually don't know what it was. I can't see anything in 2 Samuel or the parallel passages in 1 Chronicles that would give us a clue. But I do know, and I'm reminded by Dr. Woodhouse, that God's wrath is always righteous, always justified. And so whatever it was that Israel has done, Israel deserved to be punished. And the judgment of God is to involve a census, and the king is to be the instrument of that judgment. So verse 2, the king said to Joab, the commander of his army, go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beer-sheba and register the troops so I can know their number. Now, just incidentally, we in the West see censuses as benign. There's an Australian census a little while ago. Now, I don't initially jump to the idea that the government is against me when there's a census. And I don't jump to the idea that the census is an act of the judgment of God. However, in the ancient world, the reason to conduct a census was either to tax people or to conscript people into the army. And so, I can see that the census here is an act against the people by the king. Now, we're used to Army General Joab challenging his king's ideas, coming up with ideas different to his king's. Verse 3, Joab replied to the king, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord looks on, the king. But why does the king want to do this? Yet the king's order prevailed over Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army left the king's presence to register the troops of Israel. That line from Joab about the numbers increasing. You're a recipient of the blessing of God, says Joab. The numbers are going to keep going up. No point counting, but yet he doesn't have a different idea. So David does get his way. Verse 5, they crossed the Jordan, they camped in Aroah, south of the town in the middle of the valley, and then proceeded towards Gad and Jazer. They went to Gilead at the land of the Hittites, continued to Dan Jan and around to Sidon. They went to the fortress of Tyre and the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites. Afterwards they went to the Negev of Judah at Beer-sheba. When they'd gone through the whole land, they returned to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. So Joab gave the king the total of the registration of the troops. There were 800,000 valiant armed men from Israel and 500,000 men from Judah. Now, we see here that at least part of the purpose of the census was to work out the size of the potential army. But, verse 10, David's conscience troubled him after he'd taken the census of the troops. Now, back in verse 1, chapter 24, we didn't know what Israel had done wrong to cause God to judge them by David numbering them. And yet, here, we see that David has done wrong. David's got a guilty conscience, but we don't know what he's done wrong in the counting. The commentator, John Woodhouse, puts it like this: either the circumstances or the intention of this census caused David a serious attack of the conscience. He puts a series of questions. Did the census express a failure by David to trust the Lord and his promises? Was the census an act of arrogant pride? Had David formulated personal military ambitions without regard to the Lord's will? There's a whole series of things that could have been sin in David's mind. As David, he sinned in his heart as he did this census. Anyway, David, he goes to the Lord and said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, I've been very foolish. Please take away your servant's guilt. Now, at this point, we want to say, well done, David, for going to the Lord. This is hard to do. Israel had not done this when they sinned. As Dr. Woodhouse says, sin tends to harden the heart against God, blinding us to the one we have offended and the riches of his mercy. David had learned of God's grace in the past through profound experience. And this time, we see David not harden his heart, but get it right. And the response of God, well, the response of God that we'll read about tomorrow, that's going to be we're going to be scratching our heads significantly. But that's our topic for tomorrow in Daily Bible Time. But for the moment, let's just acknowledge that David here does the right thing. He has sinned, and yet he does come and confess to God. He fesses up, he deals with it, and that's to be acknowledged and admired. Thanks for joining us this Monday morning on Daily Bible Time, and looking forward to you being back with us tomorrow, and, God willing, if you're vaccinated, seeing you in church this Sunday morning at Village Church for our soft launch service. God bless.